Thomas Malthus is perhaps the most controversial classical economist. Was he a hero or a villain? Before we examine his ideas and what Millay thought of him, here is a quirky clip that talks about his life and his ideas.
It's called An Essay on the Principle of Population, and the first edition was published in 1798. But note, there are 6 editions, and the later editions have more material and more qualifications and more complexities. But we're going to start with the first edition, which is the simplest and the easiest to read. Malthus is often portrayed as a theorist of population, and of course that's correct, but I think of him as obsessed with 2 different but closely related concepts, and those are misery and vice, to use his own words. Let's see how this whole picture fits together. Malthus was concerned with combating some ideas of his time, which he associated with Godwin and Condorcet, and these ideas related to the perfectibility of man and the ability to create some kind of utopia here on earth. Malthus was skeptical. In his writings on population, I read him as trying to explain why misery and vice, these 2 key concepts, are something mankind can never get away from. By the way, note that Malthus was himself a reverend, and you can also read him as in some ways arguing against some of the more secular thinkers of his time. There are 2 key assumptions in Malthus's argument, and he lays them out pretty directly. The first assumption simply is that you need food. The second assumption, and here I'm quoting Malthus, is, quote, "The passion between the sexes is necessary." Malthus strongly believed that human population was subject to what he called a geometric increase. So for instance, if you started with 2 people, you would then end up with 4 after they had children, and then their children would give you 8, and you would get to 16 and 32, and so on. Malthus stated it pretty clearly. He thought that human population had a tendency to double roughly every 25 years. If you're wondering, by the way, Malthus grew up in a family of 7, and later he and his own wife, they had 3 children. In any case, there is this tendency for a multiplication of human beings. But the question is, will the food supply be there to support this, or must the numbers of human beings eventually contract due to famine, war, pestilence, and other forms of negative events? The problem is when you get to the food supply, and there Malthus sees the potential for only what he calls an arithmetic increase, so you could imagine having a plot of land which initially yields you, say, 25, and then you might double your yield, so 25 would go up to 50, but in Malthus's view, in the next period, you're not going to go up from 50 to 100 and then 100 and 200, that basically every period maybe you can increase productivity by 25, so then you would go from 50 to 75, and what you can see here is that the food supply, its tendency is to be increasing at a slower pace than human population. If we go back to the premise that human beings need to eat, obviously here there is a problem. It's a mistake, by the way, to read Malthus as suggesting that the geometric increase of human population and the arithmetic increase of the food supply were absolutely necessary quantitative regularities. For Malthus, they really are just tendencies, and they can be counteracted by the actions of human beings, for instance by postponing marriage. But nonetheless, it's these tendencies which make human existence difficult because population is always pressing on the food supply. When it came to economic policy, Malthus in his first edition, he was very critical of the poor laws. Basically, he thought that by supporting poor people, they increased population without increasing the means of support for that population. Subsequently, Malthus very often was considered to have a cruel point of view on this issue. Here's a good illustrative quotation from Malthus, and it shows the direction his thought is headed. And here I quote, "To these 2 great checks to population in all long-occupied countries, which I have called the preventive and the positive checks, may be added vicious customs with respect to women, great cities, unwholesome manufactures, luxury, pestilence, and war. All these checks may be fairly resolved into misery and vice." In other words, I read Malthus as saying it really is possible to have a population which is not at every point in time outracing the food supply, but the way you get there is by having a certain amount of misery and some number of individuals dying, be it through starvation or war, or you have really a very high degree of moral restraint, that is, individuals postponing marriage.
Well, that was depressing. But the video does a good job of describing Malthus's ideas and the fact that he was an ordained minister of the fire and brimstone variety. He clearly thought sex was evil and showed moral weakness, and therefore was God's punishment that we were constantly on the edge of starvation. Despite these insane philosophical leanings, Malthus stumbled onto something I think that was profound. He showed that energy in the form of food was the limiting factor in population growth. Not surprisingly, optimistic and free market people find Malthus's ideas depressing and wrong. They point out, since Malthus wrote this thesis, human population growth has accelerated and the food supply has grown even faster than that. Malay makes these points in this clip, and he points out his disdain for Malthus is less than his disdain for his modern followers.
Let us also think that the world population in the 18th century was 1 billion human beings, and when it came to the 20th century, it was around 6,200,000,000. On the other hand, today in the world, there are about 7.8 billion human beings. This means that, among other things, the iron law of the diary of Thomas Malthusianism has been a failure, and that the new versions of Malthusianism, from the Club of Friends to the Green Police, should internalize the recurrence of some of these errors that are leading to the murder of millions of people. In the Metal Room, state policy driven at the beginning of the 70s by Henry Kissinger, during the government of Richard Nixon 8.3, by Adam Smith to Murray Rothbard. Although I have a negative vision of Malthus's work, and infinitely much worse about his modern followers, I have a negative vision of his location in time and place. In fact, the system explains well what happened from the Jewish era to the 1800s of the Christian era.
The audio in that clip is a little bit garbled, but at the very end, Malay makes the point that Malthus's ideas explain the population growth and the incomes from zero until about 1800, about the time he wrote his thesis. Since Malthus's ideas seem to be detached from reality nowadays, should we just dismiss them as a crank? Well, I think you're forgetting the fact that his ideas are fundamental to the theory of evolution and still apply to every species that's ever lived on Earth other than humans. Darwin wrote in his autobiography, quote, in October 1838, that is, 15 months after I'd begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus's On Population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. In other words, Malthus's ideas are fundamental to the selection criteria in evolution, and they still apply today to every species other than human beings. So despite Malthus's incorrect fire and brimstone Christianity, he stumbled onto a very important point scientifically, which we cannot ignore. Malthus's and Darwin's ideas suggest a link between economics and evolution. Many academics have tried to make this connection, and there have been journals on point, but none of it has been accepted by mainstream economics. Almost all of it devolves into the idea that we're going to have a Malthusian disaster for humans. Surprisingly, the ideas of Malthus are critical to understanding growth theory. This is Malay's favorite chart on growth theory. It shows the GDP per capita from the year 0 till the year 2000. So how do we know this chart is accurate? Well, we have fairly good economic data for recent years, but how can we possibly know the GDP per capita for people in the year 0 to 100 AD? Malthus's ideas are key to understanding what the estimated GDP per capita was in these earlier times. We know if we go back far enough in time that humans were just like every other species. They were caught in the Malthusian Trap. And if you're caught in the Malthusian Trap, your income is just at a subsistence level. Thus, if we go far enough back in time, the GDP per capita is a subsistence living level, which is actually the level in which you get just enough calories to stay alive. And we translate that into units of currency, such as dollars. A more accurate measurement level would be the calories or the energy level that people have available, because currencies are constantly manipulated and therefore not a very good unit of measure. This leads to one of my criticisms of this chart that Malay uses. I think at best, the income from 0 to 1800 should be essentially flat. There was no growth at all in per capita income. We know from Malthus that if the population increases, there must have been extra calories or income, and if the population decreases, there must have been below subsistence levels per capita GDP. We also know that the population in Europe declined from the fall of the Roman Empire until about 650 AD, which means that the curve should be going down from 0 to about 650 AD. And yet it shows an increase. There are a number of variations on this hockey stick growth chart in economics. The one I like is this one. I like this one because it shows ups and downs. These variations are due to famines or plagues. And what happens is that if there's a plague, then the human population is reduced and the amount of available arable land increases, which increases the per capita income, which then increases the population, as Malthus suggested, until it equals the amount of food available. And as this chart shows, there's no net GDP per capita increases from the year 0 to about 1800. But I do think it fails to show the increase in per capita income that probably occurred under the Roman Empire and the decline into the Dark Ages. Either way, these details have minor effect on the overall ideas of growth theory and the overall point of these curves. We think of Malthus, or the mechanism described by Malthus, as negative. In fact, he called it the cycle of misery. But I think we're thinking about this wrong. We should think about this as the life maximizing cycle. If you think about it, Malthus's mechanisms maximize the amount of life on Earth. So while this may not be the most advantageous for each individual, it's the most advantageous for each species and life in general. The fact that Malthus was right for every other species other than humans raises what I consider the most fundamental question in economics and the most important question in evolutionary biology, which is, why did humans escape the Malthusian trap when no other species has? To the best of my knowledge, no academic researchers are working on this question in economics or in evolutionary biology, which I think is a devastating statement about our state of academic research. Long live freedom, damn it.